The morning of February 22nd, 1847, dawned with an ominous silence over the narrow mountain pass near the hacienda of Buena Vista. General Zachary Taylor, the grizzled commander known to his men as Old Rough and Ready, stood atop a rocky outcrop surveying the terrain that would soon determine the fate of American forces in northern Mexico. The bitter wind carried with it the distant sound of drums and bugles, the unmistakable approach of General Antonio López de Santa Anna's massive army. Taylor's weathered face remained impassive as he lowered his spyglass, but his heart raced. With the weight of impending catastrophe, his force of barely 5,000 men, mostly volunteers from Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and Arkansas, faced an overwhelming Mexican army of nearly 20,000 soldiers. The numbers alone would have broken lesser commanders, but Taylor had earned his reputation through decades of frontier warfare, and he would not yield this ground without extracting a terrible price from his adversaries. The strategic importance of this desolate stretch of Mexican territory could not be overstated. The battle was fought between U.S. forces, largely volunteers, under General Zachary Taylor, and the much larger Mexican army under General Antonio López de Santa Anna near Buena Vista, a village in the state of Coahuila, about 12 kilometers south of Saltillo, Mexico. Control of this pass meant control of the vital supply lines connecting the American-occupied cities of Monterrey and Saltillo. Should Santa Anna's forces break through, the entire American campaign in northern Mexico would collapse like a house of cards. Trapping thousands of soldiers behind enemy lines, Colonel Jefferson Davis, commanding the 1st Mississippi Rifle Regiment, approached Taylor's position with urgent intelligence reports. The 38-year-old West Point graduate had distinguished himself at the Siege of Monterrey, and his sharp tactical mind complemented Taylor's intuitive battlefield leadership. Davis reported that Mexican cavalry units were already probing the American flanks, testing for weaknesses in their hastily constructed defensive positions. The American position centered on a narrow valley flanked by steep ridges and deep ravines. Taylor had positioned his artillery commanded by Captain Braxton Bragg and Lieutenant John Paul Jones O'Brien on elevated ground, where their cannon could sweep the approaches with devastating crossfire. The infantry regiments had dug in behind stone walls and natural barriers, creating interlocking fields of fire that would force any attacking force into carefully prepared killing zones. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, dust clouds on the horizon announced the arrival of Santa Anna's vanguard. The Mexican general, riding at the head of his column in his elaborate uniform adorned with golden eagles and crimson sashes, cut an impressive figure against the stark landscape. His army stretched back for miles, regular infantry in blue and white uniforms, cavalry units with their colorful pennants snapping in the wind, and artillery pieces drawn by teams of oxen and mules. Santa Anna had reason for confidence beyond mere numbers. His reputation as the Napoleon of the West was built on victories against superior forces, including his triumph over the Texans at the Alamo 11 years earlier. His soldiers, many of them veterans of countless campaigns, marched with the disciplined precision of professional armies. The Mexican commander believed that one decisive assault would shatter the American volunteers and send them fleeing northward in panic. The first shots of the battle rang out just before sunset as Mexican skirmishers clashed with American pickets. In the valley below, the sharp crack of musket fire echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the deeper boom of artillery as both sides tested each other's positions. Taylor observed these preliminary exchanges with the calculating eye of a chess master, noting how Santa Anna deployed his forces and where the Mexican general might concentrate his main assault. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the two armies settled into an uneasy night of preparation. Campfires dotted the landscape like fallen stars, and the sound of weapons being cleaned and ammunition distributed carried across the valley. Tomorrow would bring a clash that would determine not only the immediate fate of Taylor's army, but potentially the entire outcome of the Mexican-American War. The stage was set for one of the most desperate and heroic defensive stands in American military history. The pre-dawn hours of February 23rd brought no relief to the exhausted, American soldiers who had spent the night strengthening their positions and checking their weapons for the 100th time. General Taylor moved among his men with the calm confidence that had earned their unwavering loyalty. Stopping to share a joke with nervous recruits from Indiana or to discuss tactical adjustments with his regimental commanders, his presence alone seemed to steady the volunteers who faced their first major battle. Against overwhelming odds, Santa Anna had not been idle during the night. Mexican engineers had positioned artillery batteries on commanding heights, while columns of infantry moved into assault positions under cover of darkness. The Mexican general's plan was both simple and devastating: a coordinated attack that would strike the American center while cavalry units swept around both flanks to cut off any retreat. He intended to crush Taylor's force so completely that no organized resistance would remain in northern Mexico. The battle began in earnest at 8 o'clock in the morning, when Mexican artillery opened a thunderous bombardment that shook the ground and sent echoes reverberating through the mountain passes. Solid shot and explosive shells rained down on the American positions, sending geysers of dirt and stone into the air, while men pressed themselves against whatever cover they could find. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Many of the volunteer soldiers had never experienced such intense artillery fire, and several companies began to waver. Captain Bragg's battery responded with characteristic precision, his gunners working their pieces with mechanical efficiency despite the incoming fire. The young artillery officer, who would later become one of the Confederacy's most controversial generals, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that made him Taylor's most trusted subordinate. His guns found their range quickly, sending solid shot crashing into the advancing Mexican columns and forcing them to deploy earlier than Santa Anna had planned. The first major crisis came when General Jose Arias' cavalry division, 3,000 strong, swept around the American left flank in a magnificent display of horsemanship and martial splendor. The Mexican horsemen, their sabers glinting in the morning sun and their battle cries echoing across the valley, struck the 2nd Indiana Regiment like a thunderbolt. The inexperienced volunteers, many of whom had never seen a cavalry charge, broke and ran in panic, leaving a dangerous gap in Taylor's defensive line. Colonel Jefferson Davis immediately recognized the mortal threat to the entire American position. Without waiting for orders, he led his Mississippi Rifles in a desperate counterattack designed to plug the gap. Before Santa Anna's infantry could exploit the breakthrough, the Mississippians, armed with percussion rifles that gave them superior range and accuracy over the Mexican muskets, advanced in perfect order despite the chaos surrounding them. Their disciplined volleys cut down the leading Mexican cavalrymen and forced Arias' division to recoil. The sight of Davis's regiment advancing steadily into the teeth of superior numbers inspired the fleeing Indiana troops to halt their retreat and begin reforming their ranks. Officers and sergeants grabbed men by their collars and pushed them back into line. Shouting encouragement and threats in equal measure, the American battle line, which had seemed on the verge of complete collapse just moments before, began to solidify once again. General Taylor himself rode forward to rally his troops, his distinctive figure instantly recognizable despite the smoke and confusion of battle. He wore his famous old brown coat and wide-brimmed hat, presenting a target that Mexican sharpshooters found irresistible, yet somehow emerging unscathed from the hail of bullets that whistled around him. His calm demeanor and encouraging words worked like magic on the volunteer soldiers, who drew strength from their commander's unshakable confidence. The morning's fighting reached its crescendo when Santa Anna personally led a massive infantry assault against the American center. 10,000 Mexican soldiers advanced in parade ground formation, their bayonets forming a glittering forest of steel while regimental bands played martial airs that could be heard above the roar of battle. It was a sight to inspire terror in the hearts of seasoned veterans, let alone the citizen soldiers who comprised the bulk of Taylor's army. As the Mexican columns approached within range, the American infantry rose from behind their stone walls and delivered a devastating volley that sent entire ranks tumbling to the ground. The volunteers had been trained to fire by company volleys, creating a continuous rolling thunder that never allowed the attackers a moment's respite. Smoke from thousands of muskets created an artificial fog that obscured the battlefield, while the screams of wounded men and horses added to the hellish symphony of combat. The fate of the American expedition in northern Mexico hung in the balance. As Santa Anna's assault pressed closer to the defensive positions, victory or defeat would be decided in the next few hours, and every soldier on both sides understood that they were participating in a battle that would be remembered for generations to come. The Mexican assault struck the American center with the force of an avalanche, as rank upon rank of blue-coated infantry surged forward with fixed bayonets and battle cries that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Santa Anna had committed his finest troops to this attack, veteran battalions that had fought in a dozen campaigns across Mexico and Central America. Their officers, resplendent in gold-braided uniforms despite the chaos of battle, led from the front with swords drawn and voices raised in encouragement to their men. General Taylor's defensive line bent under the tremendous pressure but refused to break. The Kentucky Volunteers, many of them experienced hunters and marksmen from the frontier regions, picked off Mexican officers with deadly precision while their comrades maintained steady volleys. Into the advancing masses, Colonel William McKee's 2nd Kentucky Regiment held the crucial center of the line, their position marked by a stone wall that provided excellent cover, while allowing clear fields of fire across the approaching ground. The fighting became intensely personal as the Mexican advance reached within 50 yards of the American positions. Individual acts of heroism and desperate courage occurred every few seconds along the battle line. Private John Sullivan of the 3rd Indiana Regiment bayoneted 3 Mexican soldiers before falling with a musket ball through his chest. Sergeant Michael O'Hara of the Kentucky Militia continued loading and firing, even after a Mexican saber had opened a gash across his forehead that poured blood into his eyes. Captain Bragg's artillery battery found itself under direct assault as Mexican cavalry and infantry converged on the guns from multiple directions. The young artillery officer, his uniform torn and blackened with powder smoke, worked his pieces with desperate efficiency while his gunners fell around him. As referenced by the Library of Congress historical records, the intensity of combat at this critical juncture would determine the entire battle's outcome. When Mexican soldiers reached within pistol range of his cannons, Bragg loaded them with canister shot, turning each piece into a giant shotgun that could sweep down entire ranks of attacking infantry. The crisis deepened when reports reached Taylor that his ammunition was running dangerously low. Many of the volunteer regiments had expended most of their cartridges during the morning's fighting, and the supply wagons were still miles away under escort from Saltillo. Without immediate resupply, the American position would become untenable within the hour. Taylor dispatched his most reliable officers to locate additional ammunition, while ordering his men to make every shot count. Colonel Jefferson Davis recognized that desperate measures were required to prevent a complete breakthrough. Gathering the remnants of several companies that had become scattered during the fighting, he organized a counterattack aimed at the most advanced Mexican position. The Mississippians advanced in extended order, using their superior rifles to maximum advantage while maintaining discipline under the most extreme pressure. Davis himself led the charge, his sword reflecting the afternoon sun as he urged his men forward into the teeth of enemy fire. The psychological impact of this unexpected American offensive proved greater than its tactical effect. Mexican soldiers, who had believed victory was within their grasp, suddenly found themselves under attack by determined infantry advancing with fixed bayonets. The sight of these resolute Americans moving forward despite overwhelming odds caused several Mexican companies to falter and then begin falling back toward their original positions. Santa Anna observed this reversal from his command post on a nearby hilltop, his frustration evident to the staff officers surrounding him. The Mexican general had expected his overwhelming numerical superiority to carry the day within a few hours, but the stubborn resistance of Taylor's volunteers was disrupting his carefully laid plans. Mexican casualties were mounting at an alarming rate, particularly among the irreplaceable officer corps that provided leadership and tactical expertise to his formations. The afternoon battle reached a temporary stalemate as both armies struggled to reorganize their forces and tend to their wounded. The narrow valley had become a charnel house littered with the bodies of men from both nations, while the surrounding slopes echoed with the groans of those too badly injured to crawl to safety. Medical personnel from both sides worked frantically to save lives, often within pistol shot of enemy positions, but protected by an informal truce that battlefield necessity had imposed. General Taylor used this lull to redistribute his remaining ammunition and shift troops to reinforce the most threatened sections of his line. His staff officers reported that American casualties were severe, but not yet catastrophic. The defensive positions had protected his men from the worst effects of Mexican firepower. However, everyone understood that another assault of equal intensity would likely succeed where the first had failed. The question was whether Santa Anna would recognize his opportunity and concentrate everything on one final, decisive attack. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, both commanders prepared for what each recognized would be the climactic phase of the battle. The outcome of the Mexican-American War itself might well depend on the events of the next few hours. In this remote valley, where two armies had locked themselves in mortal combat, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the blood-soaked battlefield. As Santa Anna prepared his masterstroke a coordinated assault that would employ every available unit in his massive army, the Mexican general had learned from the morning's failures and now planned to strike multiple points simultaneously, preventing Taylor from shifting reserves to meet each threat. His cavalry would sweep both flanks while his infantry smashed through the weakened American center, supported by concentrated artillery fire that would suppress the deadly accurate shooting of the volunteer marksman. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clay Jr., son of the famous Kentucky statesman and senator, commanded a battalion of Kentucky volunteers positioned on the extreme left of Taylor's line. The 20-year-old officer had graduated from West Point just 2 years earlier and possessed both the tactical training of a professional soldier and the natural leadership ability that ran in his distinguished family. As Mexican cavalry appeared on the ridge above his position, Clay calmly deployed his men in a defensive square and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The Mexican horsemen descended upon Clay's isolated battalion like an avalanche of steel and horsehair, their lances lowered and their battle cries echoing across the valley. The young colonel stood in the center of his square, his voice carrying clearly above the thunder of hooves as he encouraged his men to hold steady and wait for his command. When the cavalry reached optimal range, Clay's order rang out like a bell: fire. The devastating volley emptied dozens of saddles and sent the surviving horsemen reeling back in confusion and panic. Captain John Paul Jones O'Brien's artillery section faced its own desperate crisis as Mexican infantry overran the supporting infantry and advanced directly toward his guns. The Irish-born artillery officer, whose parents had named him for the Revolutionary War naval hero, refused to abandon his pieces despite being outnumbered 10-1. His gunners loaded their cannons with double charges of canister and continued firing until Mexican bayonets were literally touching the muzzles of their guns. O'Brien fell with 3 wounds, but continued shouting orders to his surviving men until loss of blood rendered him unconscious. The crisis in the American center deepened when Colonel William McKee's 2nd Kentucky Regiment found itself surrounded on 3 sides by advancing Mexican formations. McKee, a veteran of frontier warfare and former member of Congress, had positioned his men behind a stone wall that provided excellent protection from small arms fire but left them vulnerable to envelopment. As Mexican soldiers began appearing in his rear, McKee made the agonizing decision to attempt a fighting withdrawal to avoid complete annihilation of his command. General Taylor witnessed these multiple crises developing simultaneously and recognized that his army stood on the very brink of destruction, riding forward into the heaviest fire. The 62-year-old commander began personally rallying individual companies and battalions that had become separated during the chaotic fighting. His presence on the front lines, seemingly oblivious to the bullets whizzing around him, inspired soldiers who had given up hope to resume fighting with renewed determination. The turning point came when Major William Bliss, Taylor's adjutant, and closest confidant, spotted a gap in the Mexican assault formation that could be exploited by a determined counterattack. Bliss, a West Point graduate with extensive experience in Indian warfare, suggested that a concentrated strike by all available reserves might disrupt Santa Anna's carefully coordinated offensive. Taylor immediately grasped the tactical opportunity and began gathering every man who could still carry a rifle for one desperate gambit. Colonel Jefferson Davis, despite suffering from a painful foot wound received earlier in the battle, volunteered to lead this crucial counterattack. His Mississippi Rifles, though reduced to less than half their original strength, remained the most cohesive and disciplined unit in Taylor's army. Davis formed his men in a V-shaped formation that would allow them to deliver enfilading fire against the Mexican columns while protecting their flanks from cavalry attack. The American counteroffensive began just as Santa Anna believed victory was within his grasp. Davis's Mississippians advanced with parade ground precision despite the chaos surrounding them, their deadly accurate rifle fire cutting down Mexican officers and sergeants, who were essential for maintaining unit cohesion. Other American units, inspired by the sight of their comrades advancing rather than retreating, began their own local counterattacks that transformed the entire character of the battle. Captain Bragg's artillery, despite suffering enormous casualties, continued to pour devastating fire into the Mexican formations. The young artillery officer had lost most of his original gunners, but had replaced them with volunteers from the infantry regiments who showed remarkable aptitude for working the cannons under the most extreme conditions. His batteries sustained fire-created gaps in the Mexican lines that American infantry exploited with bayonet charges that carried them deep into enemy positions. The psychological effect of these unexpected American offensives proved devastating to Mexican morale. Soldiers who had believed they were on the verge of complete victory suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions by enemies who should have been in full retreat. Many Mexican units began falling back without orders, creating confusion that spread through Santa Anna's army like wildfire. The tide of battle, which had seemed to favor the Mexicans throughout the day, was beginning to turn in favor of Taylor's desperate defenders. As the battle entered its final phase, the narrow valley between the mountain ridges had become a hellscape of smoke, blood, and desperate men fighting for survival. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood, and the dust raised by thousands of feet and hooves, creating an atmosphere that seemed to belong more to nightmares than to the waking world. Both armies had suffered catastrophic casualties, yet neither commander was willing to concede defeat in what both recognized as a pivotal moment in the war. Santa Anna's frustration mounted as his repeated assaults failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that his numerical superiority should have guaranteed. The Mexican general had committed nearly his entire force to the attacks, holding back only a small reserve of cavalry for pursuit, operations that he had expected to begin hours earlier. His staff officers reported mounting casualties among the irreplaceable officer corps, while entire battalions had been reduced to company strength by the deadly accurate fire of the American volunteers. General Taylor's situation was equally desperate, though he maintained the stoic composure that had earned him the nickname Old Rough and Ready. His army had been reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers, many of whom were wounded but still fighting. Ammunition was critically low across the entire line, with some companies reduced to firing stones and scraps of metal when their cartridges were exhausted. Yet the American commander detected signs that Santa Anna's army was beginning to show the strain of continuous combat. The decisive moment came when Colonel Humphrey Marshall's 1st Kentucky Cavalry executed a brilliant flanking maneuver that took advantage of Mexican preoccupation with the frontal assault. Marshall, a former congressman who had volunteered for military service despite his lack of formal training, led his horsemen through a narrow defile that Mexican scouts had failed to adequately reconnoiter. The Kentucky cavalry emerged behind the main Mexican position, just as Santa Anna was committing his last reserves to what he hoped would be the final assault. Marshall's unexpected attack struck the Mexican rear echelons with devastating effect, scattering supply trains and capturing several artillery pieces. that had been providing crucial fire support to the infantry assault. More importantly, the psychological impact of this threat to their line of retreat caused panic among Mexican soldiers who had already been shaken by the stubborn American resistance. Units that had maintained discipline throughout the day's fighting began to dissolve. As individual soldiers sought safety in flight, Captain Bragg's artillery section, now reduced to a single functioning cannon served by wounded gunners and volunteer infantry, delivered the battle's final decisive blow. The young artillery officer had carefully conserved his last few rounds of ammunition for a target worthy of their employment. When Santa Anna's personal guard battalion advanced toward the American center, Bragg personally aimed his remaining gun and fired a canister round that devastated the elite formation and sent its survivors reeling backward in confusion. The sight of their most prestigious unit retreating in disorder proved to be the final straw for Mexican morale. Regiments that had fought magnificently throughout the day began pulling back without orders, creating gaps that American forces immediately exploited with local counterattacks. Santa Anna himself came under direct fire as American soldiers advanced to within pistol range of his command position, forcing the Mexican general to order a general withdrawal to avoid capture. Colonel Jefferson Davis, despite his painful wound and exhaustion from hours of combat, organized the pursuit of the retreating Mexican forces. His Mississippi Rifles, supported by elements of other regiments that had managed to maintain unit cohesion, harassed the Mexican rear guard and captured additional artillery pieces. Along with hundreds of prisoners, the disciplined withdrawal that Santa Anna had planned quickly degenerated into a disorganized rout. As American cavalry units joined the pursuit, the battle's conclusion came as darkness fell over the valley, bringing an end to combat that had raged for nearly 12 hours. Mexican campfires that had dotted the landscape the previous evening were nowhere to be seen, replaced by the moans of wounded men and the victory shouts of American soldiers, who could hardly believe they had survived such an ordeal. General Taylor's small army had achieved what military historians would later call one of the most remarkable defensive victories in American military history. The cost of victory was enormous for both sides. American casualties totaled over 700 killed, wounded, and missing from a force that had numbered fewer than 5,000. At the battle's beginning, Mexican losses were far heavier, with estimates ranging from 3,000 to 4,000 casualties, including many irreplaceable officers and sergeants. Santa Anna's army, though still numerically superior, had been so badly mauled that it would pose no further threat to American operations in northern Mexico. As medical personnel from both armies worked to save the wounded and bury the dead, the full magnitude of what had been accomplished began to sink in among the survivors. A small force of American volunteers, many of whom had never seen combat before that morning, had stood their ground against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious through sheer determination and superior leadership. The Battle of Buena Vista would become legendary in American military history as proof that citizen soldiers could match professional armies when properly led and motivated. The dawn of February 24th revealed the full extent of the carnage that had transformed the peaceful valley into one of the most contested battlefields of the Mexican-American War. Vultures circled overhead while burial details from both armies worked to inter the dead before the desert heat could make their grim task even more unbearable. General Taylor walked among his wounded soldiers, offering words of comfort and ensuring that medical supplies were distributed according to need, rather than rank or nationality. Santa Anna's retreat had become a disaster of epic proportions as his demoralized army struggled southward through the mountain passes. The Mexican general had lost not only thousands of irreplaceable soldiers, but also most of his artillery train and supply wagons, captured by pursuing American cavalry or abandoned when their teams were killed or scattered. His dream of crushing Taylor's force and driving the Americans from northern Mexico lay shattered on the bloody ground around Buena Vista. The strategic implications of the American victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. News of Taylor's triumph would electrify the American public and provide crucial political support for the continuation of the war effort. More importantly, from a military perspective, The defeat eliminated Santa Anna's army as an effective fighting force in northern Mexico, freeing American commanders to concentrate their efforts on other theaters of operation without fear of attack. From their rear, Colonel Jefferson Davis emerged from the battle as one of its greatest heroes, his tactical brilliance and personal courage having played crucial roles in the American victory. Despite his wound, which would trouble him for the rest of his life, Davis had maintained perfect discipline among his Mississippi rifles throughout the most desperate moments of the fighting. His innovative V-shaped formation had become the stuff of military legend, studied in staff colleges for decades afterward as an example of tactical ingenuity. Under extreme pressure, Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery performance had been equally spectacular, his battery having fired over 400 rounds during the course of the battle. While maintaining deadly accuracy despite being under constant attack, the young artillery officer's ability to coordinate his fire with infantry movements and his personal bravery in serving the guns when most of his original crew had fallen wounded established his reputation as one of the Army's finest gunners. The human cost of victory weighed heavily on General Taylor's mind as he surveyed the battlefield, where so many brave men had fallen. Among the American dead was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clay, Jr., whose battalion had held its position to the last man rather than retreat in the face of overwhelming cavalry attacks. The young officer's death would devastate his famous father and deprive the nation of a promising military leader who had shown exceptional courage and tactical skill during his brief career. Captain John Paul Jones O'Brien's artillery section had been virtually annihilated during the battle, with the Irish-born officer himself critically wounded while serving his guns. Until Mexican bayonets reached the cannon muzzles, O'Brien's heroic stand would become legendary throughout the artillery branch, inspiring future generations of gunners to maintain their positions regardless of personal danger. His recovery from his wounds would be slow and incomplete, leaving him partially disabled but still determined to continue his military service. The Mexican wounded presented a particular challenge for American medical personnel, who were already overwhelmed by the needs of their own casualties. General Taylor's decision to provide equal medical care to enemy wounded, despite his limited resources, demonstrated the humanitarian values that distinguished professional soldiers from mere killers. Mexican officers expressed amazement at this treatment, having expected execution or abandonment according to the harsh customs that often governed frontier warfare. International reaction to the Battle of Buena Vista would prove highly favorable to the American cause, with European military observers expressing admiration for the tactical skill displayed by Taylor's volunteer soldiers. The victory demonstrated that democratic societies could produce citizen soldiers capable of matching the performance of professional armies when properly led and motivated. This lesson would prove particularly valuable during the coming crisis that would test American democracy to its very foundations. The aftermath of the battle also revealed the fundamental differences in military philosophy between the two combatants. Santa Anna's reliance on overwhelming numbers and frontal assaults had been defeated by Taylor's emphasis on defensive positions, accurate firepower, and tactical flexibility. American officers had consistently demonstrated superior initiative and adaptability, responding quickly to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining unit cohesion under extreme pressure. The personal relationships forged during the battle would have profound implications for American history in the decades ahead. Jefferson Davis and Braxton Bragg would serve together again during the coming Civil War, though on the opposite side from their former commander Zachary Taylor. The bonds of mutual respect and shared hardship created at Buena Vista would influence political and military decisions long after the immediate participants had passed from the scene. As the American Army began the process of reorganization and resupply, General Taylor reflected on the lessons learned during the desperate fighting. The battle had proven that volunteer soldiers, when properly trained and led, could achieve remarkable feats of arms against professional adversaries. This knowledge would prove invaluable during the trials that lay ahead for the American Republic. The weeks following the Battle of Buena Vista saw General Taylor's small army transformed from a collection of volunteer regiments into a seasoned fighting force that had proven itself under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Word of their victory spread throughout the United States like wildfire, creating a wave of national pride and support for the war effort that had been wavering in the face of mounting casualties and political opposition. Newspapers across the nation proclaimed Taylor a national hero, while his soldiers were celebrated as examples of American courage and determination. The strategic consequences of Santa Anna's defeat resonated throughout Mexico and the broader theater of the Mexican-American War. The Mexican general's retreat southward left the entire northern region of Mexico under effective American control, freeing General Winfield Scott's forces for their planned assault on Mexico City itself. Santa Anna's army, once the most formidable military force in Mexico, had been so thoroughly shattered that it would require months to reorganize and re-equip before it could again threaten American operations. That President James Knox Polk's administration found itself in the enviable position of having achieved its primary strategic objectives through the heroic efforts of soldiers who had volunteered to serve their country. The annexation of Texas had been successfully defended, while American forces now controlled vast territories that would eventually become the southwestern United States. The victory at Buena Vista had validated Polk's expansion policies and silenced many of his political critics who had questioned the wisdom of war with Mexico. General Taylor's reputation as a military commander was forever established by his performance during those desperate 24 hours in the mountain valley, his calm leadership under pressure, his ability to inspire volunteer soldiers to fight beyond their apparent capabilities, and his tactical skill in utilizing inferior numbers against a vastly superior enemy made him a natural candidate for political office. The nickname Old Rough and Ready became synonymous with American military virtue and democratic leadership. The individual acts of heroism displayed during the battle became the stuff of American military legend, riddled in countless histories and memoirs for generations afterward. Colonel Jefferson Davis's tactical innovations and personal courage established him as one of the war's outstanding regimental commanders, while Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery performance set new standards for accuracy and effectiveness under combat conditions. These men would carry the lessons learned at Buena Vista into future conflicts, applying their hard-won experience to new challenges. The international implications of the American victory extended far beyond the immediate theater of war. European military observers had watched the conflict with intense interest, seeking to understand how democratic societies might perform in major wars against traditional military powers. The performance of American volunteer soldiers at Buena Vista demonstrated that citizen armies could achieve remarkable results when properly organized and led, a lesson that would influence military thinking throughout the 19th century. The technological aspects of the battle also provided valuable insights into the evolution of warfare. During the mid-19th century, the effectiveness of rifled firearms in the hands of trained marksmen had proven decisive against traditional infantry tactics based on massed formations and bayonet charges. American artillery, though outnumbered, had demonstrated superior accuracy and rate of fire, suggesting that quality could indeed triumph over quantity when properly employed. The medical lessons learned during and after the battle contributed significantly to improvements in military health care and battlefield medicine. The treatment of massive casualties under primitive conditions had tested American medical capabilities to their limits, revealing both strengths and weaknesses that would influence military medical doctrine for decades. The humanitarian treatment of enemy wounded established precedents for the conduct of war that would eventually be codified in international law. The political ramifications of Taylor's victory extended into the highest levels of American government and society. His emergence as a national hero made him an attractive presidential candidate, while his performance at Buena Vista provided concrete evidence of American military capability that influenced foreign policy decisions throughout the remainder of the 19th century. The battle had demonstrated that the United States possessed both the will and the ability to project military power beyond its borders when national interests were at stake. As referenced in historical documentation from the period, the Battle of Buena Vista represented a watershed moment in American military history, proving that citizen soldiers could achieve remarkable victories when properly led and motivated. The courage displayed by men like Henry Clay Jr., who died leading his battalion against overwhelming odds, and John Paul Jones O'Brien, who served his guns until enemy bayonets reached the cannon muzzles, established standards of military excellence that would inspire future generations of American soldiers. The memory of those 2 days in February 1847 would live on in American military tradition, reminding soldiers that victory could be achieved against seemingly impossible odds through courage, discipline, and superior leadership. The Battle of Buena Vista had proven that the American experiment in democratic government could produce military forces capable of competing successfully against the professional armies of traditional powers, establishing the United States as a major military force on the world stage and laying the foundation for its eventual emergence as a global superpower.